My name is Dave Gable. Sandie probably told you some things about our background. We had the chance to be with her and her husband for a couple of weeks in Greece when they lived in Athens. We were over there doing a marriage thing, my wife and I, and we have been involved with them, so we have gotten to know her pretty well. She asked me to come do this because of the kind of class it is. And here were her instructions, so let me pass them on to you so that you know why I'm doing what I'm doing. She said, give a highly personalized version of Assemblies of God history, that your task is to learn about the Assemblies of God as an organization. And she asked me in that I have served at the local level, I've served at the district level, Southern California, the southern half of the state, with the Assemblies of God. And I've served for a while during the 70s. That was an ancient period, long time back, when people had bell-bottom pants instead of tight-bottom pants. And we were opposite in a lot of ways. But I was the national director of a program for a while there, so I got to travel the country in regard to that and got to see the assemblies as a whole. I've spent my entire life in it. So that's how come she asked me to do this, and to be highly personal in talking about it, rather than just give you a group of a bunch of dates and events that you can regurgitate for a test. One of the things I want to do is talk about the Assemblies of God's specialty. I don't know if it's a specialty, but it's one of the wonderful things about us that we have had enough sense to do carpet time, seek the mind of the Spirit, get totally confused by what's happening in our world, and do enough time with God to get some ideas and try some new stuff and go off and do different things. And some of them worked. And some of them are doing that. And I've asked a young ministry friend of mine, Elliot Bland, to come here and talk about that process of still going on. What I did 50 years ago at a national level, he is doing on a state level, or at least the network level of Southern California, in doing something that hasn't ever been done, that has people looking from outside the assemblies at us as a group of crazy, but maybe it's going to work, experimenters, so that we set patterns in many ways for other ministries. So let me take that kind of approach. Let me find out first how much you know about the Assemblies of God. If there were a spectrum where 10 was you grew up in an AG church, you went to a vacation Bible school, you went to youth camps, you know exactly what I'm talking about when the Assemblies of God, you've been in it, your church was clearly identified as one. If that's a 10, and if on the other hand 1 is you didn't even know what an Assembly of God, you'd never even heard the term until you came here to Vanguard, you're vaguely aware that there is one, you're still not sure what we believe or how different we are from anybody else. And if that's a 1, okay, how many any 10s here? You're growing up in this thing. Okay, where? Which church? Are you from around here? No, you're from someplace else. Okay. From where? Where? I'm sorry. Hawaii. Okay. Whoa. They got some big AG churches over there. Anyway, how many of you would say I'm a 1? I really didn't have any background at all. Okay. How many would say I'm exactly in the middle? I know about it pretty much now, but I've been to an AG church at least. I know what you're talking about. And how many of you would say I'm still down on the low end of things? I'm acquainted with the history of the organization, but I don't know that much about it. Okay, that helps me a bunch. So for the ones that know a great deal about the Assemblies of God, I'm going to probably aim at the 3s and 4s around here and talk about it that way, so that you can understand a little bit where I'm coming from. You are getting set to graduate. When you graduate, you who have friends who have gone on to graduate school, are they getting into grad schools with no difficulty? Are they finding places to go? Nod your head yes or no or whatever. You know people that are going there. Do they have any difficulty getting hired as teachers if you leave here as at Vanguard? Are people finding employment in their field of study? And the answer is, yeah, you are. Okay, when I got out of school, I applied to go to seminary. When I applied at seminary, they said, well, there was two things wrong with my status as a graduate of a small Assemblies of God Bible college just north of Philadelphia. For one thing, we could not give degrees. We were qualified, we had an adequate faculty. It wasn't until a couple years later that some inner dialogue within the Department of Education of the state of Pennsylvania was sent by mistake to our president, in which they said, it is a Pentecostal school and we are not interested in having them be accredited to give degrees in the state of Pennsylvania. There was that kind of, who are these people? What kind of a strange cult is this? We are reluctant to recognize them as those who have put together an adequate intellectual process. So the one thing I didn't have a degree. I got a handshake when I got out. The other thing is I applied to seminary, and when I went to the seminary, a Presbyterian seminary, they said, well, okay, you'll have to take 6 hours of tests though. You have to take a 2-hour test in Greek, a 2-hour test in world history, a 2-hour test in world literature, and we would compare your answers to somebody who had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, or one of the state colleges back in Pennsylvania. We simply don't know the school that you're coming from. We don't know anything about that. And in addition to that, we don't know anything about the Assemblies of God. We have never had anybody go through our whole program and graduate. So, number one, even if we accept you as a student, we will not guarantee you a degree at the end of the 3 years. We want to see what your life is like before we will not promise you a degree, even if you complete the academic work. And number two, we will only allow 2 people of the Assemblies of God in at any one time, because we don't know who you are, what you might be like. I doubt that you will have those kinds of experiences when you sign up or when you apply for grad school, if you do so. So my thing was, the question then comes, what's the difference between then and now? Well, now you are facing a very different kind of world at graduation than I did, because the Assemblies of God has demonstrated its theological integrity. We've put together schools where our academic standing, our intellectual standing is adequate, but we have, for a great extent, been accepted by the rest of the church. Why were we not in 1963, when I graduated from Bible college and wanted to go into seminary? Okay, let's go all the way back to the beginning then and talk about where we come from. Almost every turn of the century, you're not old enough to even remember 2000, there was a lot of fuss about, as we turn to year 2000, there are people that think Jesus is coming, there are people that think it's going to be the end of the world, perhaps, it's something about those important dates. You get focused on them. There was that same kind of focus in 1900, but it had some unusual theological aspects to it. For one thing, at that point, the church was largely either Protestant or Catholic. Some of you, I understand, have a Catholic, you had a Catholic background more than an evangelical or a Protestant one. At that point, there was a great deal of enmity between the two. You were either one or the other. You were Catholics did not anticipate seeing Protestants in heaven, nor did Protestants expect to see Catholics there. Now we understand, we look a little more broadly at it, we say both these groups are tying into the Apostles' Creed, and we need to find ways to talk to one another, because we obviously are serving Christ. But there was a big division back then. There were Protestants, there were Catholics, and of the Protestants, it was largely evangelicals, some on them along some kind of a spectrum. But there began to be, because there had been for a long time a pretty much focused aspect on the academic and rational aspects of faith, and there were people that were hungry to see something more lively and living in the church. So there grew, toward the end of the 1800s, there grew to be a lot of interest in seeing the stuff that was written about in the book of Acts. People speaking in tongues, people casting out demons, people getting healed. there arose a great interest in that. And there were people that began to report here and there that the phenomenon occurred, that they sought the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit came upon them. And these phenomena, places where these phenomena were first beginning to be reported. Then in 1906, a really big one hit called at Azusa Street in Los Angeles. How many are hearing the term for the very first time? The Azusa Street Revival? Don't be, there's no, are you hearing that for the first time? Or are you familiar with that, the concept? Azusa Street? Okay. Azusa Street was a largely black church to which white people began to come very quickly, where the Spirit fell, where people began to speak in tongues, where there were Pentecostal phenomena, open Pentecostal phenomena, like in the book of Acts, that began to occur. But within a couple weeks, they outgrew the little place where they were. They got a mission street. This is a book written about the Azusa Street mission by the guy that knows most about it in the world. His name is Mel Robeck. His son, John Mark Robeck, is one of your professors here at school. Probably if you would have had a Bible major, you would have had a class from him. And there broke out there a revival that simply went 24/7 for about 3 years. Within a couple days after it started, there was a big earthquake in San Francisco. So there was really this sense of the end times are upon us, great earthquakes are taking place, great revivals taking place. And the meeting at Azusa Street in a small place, there's no building left anymore. Azusa Street remains as a street. They brought the name back out. The building is long gone, but for 3 years it didn't shut down, and thousands of people came through there and opened their lives to the Holy Spirit, and they received and baptism and infilling. They called it that. It was many of them were already Christian, and they wanted something new to come into their life, a second experience after salvation where God filled them and they had power to witness. And they began to say, this is what occurred to us. So the meeting was set up then, and it was explosive. They developed a mailing list that had thousands of people. People from there went out all over the country. The guy who wrote Azusa Street has now, during the pandemic, he's written 2 more. One is about what happened to the people that left Azusa Street and went throughout the United States. The other is about those who left Azusa Street and went out around the world. It was there was an immediate, we want to go, we feel empowered by God to go and talk about this whole experience. Some of what occurred was that people would go out to the end of the street lines. There in Los Angeles, the streetcars would work. They had their cable cars all set up the way they would travel out, and they would go to the end of the line, and they would hold street meetings there. Sometimes they'd get put into jail. Sometimes they'd attract others. Sometimes it would succeed well enough for them to start churches. And now we have scattered all over the LA basin. We have churches that go all the way back to the early 1900s that were started at the end of the street line, wherever the last station was. That would be the final point. They would set up their street meeting, that would become a church. And we have in our Assemblies of God of Southern California, we have churches that go back to having been planted in those kind of ways. They're century-old churches for the most part now, but they were done exactly that way. Here's where the school comes in. There was about 3 years of 24/7 meeting. They didn't even shut it down. Then it became a more nearly normal church with more nearly hours. But there was another outburst in around 10 through 12, 1910 through 12 through up into 14, up in that period, that was an outburst again of the same kind of energy and the same kind of attendance. Here is the story, or here's a book that was put out on the 75th anniversary. I got this out of your library a couple minutes ago. It's, I'm going to pass it around in the easiest of ways here, just send it around, glance down through it. It tells the story of the origins of some of those churches and the guy that ended up being the first leader of the Southern California churches. George Eldridge was a man from back east who was hungry for God in his life. He became a Methodist pastor, and then his wife got sick, and the Methodists did not pray for people to be healed. They simply did not see that as part of what God was doing. So he went and was prayed for by other groups, and she was healed. God healed her. She was sick one day, better the next. The Methodists said, "You can't teach this in the Methodist church. You need to find some other place to do it." So even though he was way up in the organization, he left and joined the Missionary Alliance Church. And he was transferred to Southern California. He came out here because he had heard about Azusa Street. And it wasn't enough then that he was healed, but while he was out here, he and his wife both had the experience of being filled with the Spirit and speaking in tongues. And the whole Pentecostal, all the things that were opened up in the book of Acts suddenly became their portion all over. And he said that he was no longer welcome in the Missionary Alliance Church. So at 63 years of age in 1910, now I chaired church planting for 17 years. Let me tell you, we did not have anybody planting a brand new church at 63 years of age. It was all guys like Elliot and guys in their 20s and 30s that were eager to get out there and do a new thing because, boy, it's a lot of work. But the Eldridges in their 60s, planted a church in 1910. They went to Azusa Street, got it, then said, we want to do some work for God. So they just moved a mile or two down the road and started Bethel Temple. And Azusa Street only had 8-foot ceilings. So they made sure the ceilings in their building were going to be a lot higher when they eventually build a church. Well, George Eldridge and his wife succeeded well enough. They had 2 daughters who were missionaries in India. One was married to a guy named Turnbull, one was married to a guy named Needham. So they asked their 2 daughters, would you come and your husbands come back and help us because our church is blowing up, taking off here in Los Angeles. We want to get rolling, we want it to grow. So the 2 daughters came back, and Lewis Turnbull and his wife, the one daughter, took over the church, and they started a Bible college, or not a Bible college, but a ministry institute, and Charles Needham, the other, took over and started to turn it into a school. That's where Vanguard comes from. That is the roots of Vanguard University. When you read that, Declare His Glory, you'll read the story of that has pictures of a whole bunch of all those old churches that came into being, popping up all over here. One of the first, Ruth Wilson, who was the wife of the guy that was the music director here at the time, wrote that. And they tell about the church at Fresno. I was the pastor of the church in Fresno. So I'm in there at a couple different places. I'm there as a district officer, and my name is also mentioned as one of the guys that pastored the church in Fresno. The church in Fresno was begun because one of the people who bought into the whole idea that God wants to move in a style that we call Pentecostal, because of what happened on the day of Pentecost, then one of the people that was most affected was Amy Semple McPherson, who became a woman evangelist. How many have heard the name Amy Semple McPherson before? Is that brand new to any of you? Brand new. You've heard a little bit about it. Okay. She probably was as well known as any movie star in LA at the time. She built her church, which is it's up in Angeles. It's called Angeles Temple. It's up in Echo Park. Was the biggest open dome church of its time when she built it. She had movie stars in attendance. She had a dynamic thing going on. When there was an earthquake in Santa Barbara, she went on the radio, and the government was still trying to figure out what to do. Amy Semple McPherson put out the call on the radio station, which the church owned, and she had help flowing out. She had assistance flowing out to the people in Santa Barbara before the government could get itself organized. She had that kind of dynamism. She had some difficulties in her life as well. But anyway, that was part of where we come from. So there were churches like that now popping up all over the country. There were there was a number of Pentecostal organizations that they pulled themselves together under various names. There was one which predated the Azusa Street revival, called the Church of God in Christ, that was led by an African-American man named Mason. And that was the oldest, and that was welcome. That was one of those. There were a bunch of others that occurred. But in 1914, a group mostly, what was now, the things that happened at Azusa Street are now happening all over the country. And there are churches and small groups of people studying. They would call a Bible study. They would study the Bible in the mornings. They'd go out and knock on doors and invite people to church in the afternoons, and they would have services at night. And churches were started all over the country like that. There was, then in 1914, about 300 people, almost all white except for Mason, who was the head of the organization that existed at the time. He was there. Almost all the rest of them were white, but they came together and organized and called themselves the Assemblies of God. They wanted to organize for a couple reasons. Number one, they wanted to have some kind of an ordaining organization, because the primary ways that people traveled back then, or the way that people traveled, was by railroad. And if you had an official ordination, you could get a big cut on your railroad costs. Your ticket only cost a fraction of what it did for a non-ministerial person. So they wanted to become some kind of an organizing body so that they could get ordained and handle this thing, and not just have Mason off someplace and his organization. They wanted to have something that spread out wider. Another thing that they wanted, and this is the one, that one doesn't show up in the official documents, that reason. The one that does show up in the official documents is, we want to organize to do foreign missions better. We want to organize world missions. We want to send out, we want to find some kind of an approval agency so that we can stamp somebody as worthy of support and begin to send people out around the world and tackle some new stuff. Because right from the start, at Azusa Street, boom, man, they were sending people off out to around the world. So they got themselves organized. Probably another aspect of this was that Jim Crow was alive and well back then. And a lot of the guys, especially in the American South, were not all that happy about being in an organization that was led primarily by African Americans. That was back in 1914 that they organized. So we became even though Azusa was black, white, whatever color, everybody was welcome there. It wasn't always comfortable what happened. There were several times that white people tried to take over from the primary pastor, whose name was William Seymour, who was a black man. Some people, I can't resist it. Somebody says, how do we know God has a sense of humor? Because he sent revival through a one-eyed black man called Willie Seymour. And bad pun, sorry about that. Can't resist it though. Seymour had been there in charge there. He lived up to about 1920, and his wife ran the church until about 1930 when she died. But that was black-led. Every time he welcomed a white into some kind of leadership with him, the white person would try to take over. And finally, he just made the rule, okay, it's going to be a black organization at the top. That is not part of the normal Assembly of God story that comes out, but that's part of the reality of it that Mel Robeck and the research that is done can explain it for those of you who are curious about it, who want to get into it. So we have this organization now that began in 1914. One of the things that was, they were so open to new things. There were new revelations because it was all new. There were just new things popping all over. And about in the mid-teens there somewhere, they'd have a campground up at Arroyo Seco at a park between Los Angeles and Pasadena, where the river canyon comes down through there. And a guy had a revelation that God was the Father, became the things were focused into just one person of the Godhead, that it was just Jesus only, not Father, Son, and Spirit, but just one. And there began to be a unity doctrine that was preached, that God was just one and did not have the three persons were not there in the traditional way. And the Assemblies of God, when this teaching had only been in existence for a couple years, but a young theologian named Jerry Roswell Flower ran into this teaching, and even though about a third of the group that were following God at that time liked the idea because they had some text to anchor it to. And he called a national meeting about 1916 or so, and they dealt with the issue and said, no, this is heresy. We got to hold the doctrine true. And so even though it was triggered in such a way, they came to that decision, got rid of that. They were smaller in size, but they stayed pure, and there have been various challenges to traditional doctrine that have been dealt with along the way. What was remarkable about the group, though, was their way, the creativity of the Spirit began to pop out. Because if you open your life to the possibility that the Spirit is going to do things like speak in tongues through you, like pray for the things that cannot happen in somebody, you build a life of seeing that God can do that which is not normal. And that has been the mark of Assemblies of God people or Pentecostal people. So we have been open to new kinds of ministry popping up along the way. We've been open to actually acting on that idea of what could occur. Let me tell you a story about your president. Just a couple years ago, when I was still involved here, I served here for a year or two as the representative after I left the district office, where I was full-time involved with church planning and missions liaison and men's ministry and some things over at our district headquarters. I came and volunteered here and just attended your chapels for a couple of years, and then went out and talked to biblical groups, our church groups about the school, and would come here and talk to church groups or to school groups about what was happening out in our churches to try to keep the flow of communication between the campus and our churches good. And it's always uphill work to do that. You probably have not had a strong tie to the churches that have been supportive and creative in putting this organization together, because it's always uphill work to keep that line of communication going, because we're two different worlds with two different agendae, and so we stay involved. But one of the things that happened after Beals was president, we had Eric Metaxas come. Eric Metaxas is a current popular writer now. He's got a book on Bonhoeffer. He's got a book on miracles. He had just printed one on miracles. And so the gal who was in charge of the vice president of promotion here at the time, Kelly Conwisher, she and her husband had served as Presbyterian pastors right across the river from New York City, where Eric Metaxas lived and did his thing, and they knew him. They had gotten acquainted with him during their years back there. And Kelly and her husband Richard were pastoring at St. Andrew's Presbyterian down here in Newport at the time. So we brought in the school and the church together. St. Andrew's and Vanguard brought in Eric Metaxas to speak on miracles. Okay, he got up, and he didn't just speak. Richard Conwisher, the Presbyterian pastor of New St. Andrews, Mike got up, introduced the whole evening, and then Richard Conwisher and Eric Metaxas dialogue back and forth, and two really sharp people, good wits, good people. It was a sparkly evening, man. Those of us who were in the crowd and the place was full we were right there. Conwisher's last question to Eric Metaxas, the author, who had written a whole book about miracles, how miracles were occurring in the church, was to say, "Why did you write this book?" And Metaxa said, I wrote it to encourage the church to believe for miracles. And Richard said, isn't that great? And they were, all right, give him a hand. Fine, we're all done. And they gave him a hand, and they turned it back to Mike Beals to close the service, close the meeting. And Beals gets up, and here's where the difference between a Presbyterian and a Pentecostal show up. Beals goes up to the platform and says, who here needs a miracle? Stand up right now, let's pray. And that dynamism, the courage to take that kind of step and risk, and ask people to challenge, to bring your need to God and see what God might do. Man, the whole place just blinked, and people began to stand up, and Beals led out in a prayer full of faith and confidence, and we trusted that God was coming to and touching some of those people. I don't know, I did never hear of anything that would have occurred, but there were, and that is not totally outside of Richard Conwiser's experience and repertoire to do something like that. But the point was, when the two were there, it was the Pentecostal that did it. So it is that kind of openness to new sorts of ministry and new kinds of ways that has marked our AG kind of thing. We've grown now. It probably is the best story in church history that an organization that began just a little over 100 years should now number around 70 million around the world. I don't think that there's any story like that in church history where but the Assemblies of God of the U.S. and our sister churches that we have planted, we and Pentecostal churches in other lands have then planted around the mission fields in the world all over. We have become a significant player that here I am, as I can still remember what it felt like to be told, we don't know enough about you we will only let two of you in at one time to our seminary. And now we are a significant player in the world church affairs. Now things have opened up. Here I am as an Assembly of God National Director of Chi Alpha. This was that started when vets came home from World War II, and we started, they went to school on the GI Bill, they went to college, and they started Bible studies all over, and they formed an organization called Chi Alpha, Christou Apostoloi. The first letter is Chi, and T and Alpha, XA, it goes by. And we were organizing on secular college campuses, and I grew up in a public high school. I went to this little Bible college. I was going off to a seminary at the time, and a guy came and said, God's doing stuff on secular college campuses. Wouldn't you like to see God do something on Penn State or down at University of Pennsylvania or wherever? And all I knew was there was school over here and there was church over here, and it never even occurred to me that anything like that could happen. And my heart jumped down inside of me, and I went up and talked to the guy afterward and said, I'd like to be involved in that. So there was no money in it, so I just did that. My wife and I, with a daughter, we simply made ourselves available, and God supplied our need, and we ran around all over the campuses of the northeast part of the United States saying, God's going to do something on campus when Assemblies of God kids go off to school there and start Bible studies. He's going to help us. We're going to lead people to Christ. I came out to be a youth pastor in California for 4 years, and then was asked to come back to be the national director for Chi Alpha. I had unusual qualifications, and I had both seminary and some practical experience on the campus. I'd been working with college students in Fresno. So I got back there, and I got to see how those things occurred. But we were not welcomed at that time by the other campus organizations. Campus Crusade for Christ was at that point the largest thing, and they were beginning to have the big Jesus movements of the 70s, the big gatherings. The first time there were gatherings like Jesus 73, or when Christians came together you get tens of thousands of people gathering in those first giant meetings back in the Jesus movement. But they said, yeah, you can come, but you got to not speak in tongues even in devotions during the meetings or during the days in which we're having the meetings. And here we are as a whole bunch of Pentecostals who were that is part of our devotional life. And we are saying, whoa, I think you're misunderstanding who we are. We're not going to run around in public doing anything weird, but we at least we will retain that as part of our devotional life. But there was that kind of a suspicion. And now I go back to visit the national directors of Chi Alpha, which has taken off. When I went back as the national director, the people that are involved full-time, like Elliot is involved full-time with Youth Alive here, which is a whole new thing among high school students. There were only about a half a dozen of us in the whole country. And it was just beginning to take off, that there was, God blessed us. By the time I had left that job by the end of the 70s, there were about 100 people that were full-time. Now there are over 1,000 full-time ministers. We are on hundreds of campuses all across the country, and the graduates of that program have now gone out and become a significant part of our World Missions Task Force, and have brought the same kind of mentality. You don't have to have a building in order to have a church. What you have to have is, you don't need a pulpit, you need a table, where all you need is a table to sit and talk about the reality of Christ and make a friendship and grow up from there. But what we saw, the thing that stood out about that whole thing was that in Chi Alpha, I got to be part of a place where there was a need, there was an opportunity. We sought the mind of the Spirit about how to develop a whole new kind of ministry. God blessed it, and it took off and began to go somewhere. And that is what has happened in event after event, or kind of ministry after kind of ministry. There was a Pennsylvania pastor named David Wilkerson who was clear out in the country, out in the sticks, who had been praying and seeking God, and he read about some guys that in a gang that got in trouble. There had been some crime in the streets in New York City. And he went up there and he began to preach to people in the gangs, and God began to save them. Their lives were transformed, and now Teen Challenge has become our thing. That just in Southern California, we have over 700 beds of full-time people in a drug program which has around 90% effectiveness, and that if you go through a year at Teen Challenge, you don't go back to drugs after that. It has incredible rates. So what we have seen is where people came and looked at new situations, sought the mind of the Spirit, and tried something new. It is the nature of the Pentecostal to believe that God will bless a brand new way of doing things. That's at our core. And so God has blessed us, and we're doing okay. For instance, right now, talk about the history of the Assemblies of God in both world missions and home missions. We're trying new sorts of things all the time, and some of them are working. One of the things that I do is I like the outdoors. I've gotten involved national parks and camping and whatnot, and I've hiked a chunk of the Appalachian Trail. Sandie told me that she told you about that I had done something like that. I've been involved with a ministry called Christian Ministers in the National Parks, ACMNP, and I am the only Assemblies of God person on it, and I go to board meetings. And what is normal anymore is that I will go to a board meeting that has people from all different denominations in the U.S., and somewhere in the course of the meeting we'll turn around and say, yeah, well, you guys in the assemblies, you're doing some stuff over there, and we got to get into that. Or someone will say, they're way out there, they're checking out some stuff, they've got some things, they're experimenting, and some of that stuff's working. And I will hear that normally as a thing where I go to an interdenominational meeting. So I love that part of our tradition, and we don't have it perfectly together. Here in the U.S., we are the only denomination the large denomination, and I use that term loosely because we're not supposed to even use that term. We got kicked out of denominations, and it's part of our language that we formed a fellowship, not a denomination, way back in 1914. But it's working. We experiment with stuff, and God uses us enough so that the thing keeps growing and abounding here. So you are involved with a school that has that in its tradition. Vanguard has been one of the first of the Assemblies of God universities across the country to experiment with opening the door to liberal arts studies as opposed to just being a Bible institute or a course of Bible study. And it's been first, and there's been some scholars along the way, some wonderful people that have come through here. And what has brought this thing into being is the nature of that new thing is hopefully that which will continue to mark us as we go along and as we check new stuff out. Let me turn to Elliot. Elliot, come on up here for a moment and talk about some things. I was involved with secular campus outreach. I was involved with outreach to the college campus and university campuses all across the country. And now we're involved in them. We saw the thing take off. We are in a number of the Ivy League colleges. We are in where we do best is in Happy Valley State College. Off in the middle states, we do really well there. We have some groups that run over 1,000 in size, but we also are the biggest group at the University of Virginia, for instance, right there in where Thomas Jefferson set the thing up. So the doing of new things in old places is part of what we are about, and Elliot's involved in a current, 50 years later, he's using some of the same organizational language and names that I did back then, but they're doing some new stuff that has the same kind of responding to a different situation. Tell them about Youth Alive.
Yeah. Thanks, Pastor Dave. I love hearing Pastor Dave just talk about anything, especially the past of the AG. There's a passion there, especially since he was there for it, at Azusa Street. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, he's not that old, but so Youth Alive is just a movement that actually Pastor Dave was a part of. It was a magazine, if I'm correct, right? They were doing the stuff on the college campus. They said we need to do stuff for the high school. They had a popular magazine that was published called Youth Alive. And so he was part of the foundation of it, but it's reaching the campus missionally. That's our purpose, and that's the way we do it in Southern California. I don't know where a lot of you guys went to high school and junior high. There's probably some type of Christian club at your high school, maybe an FCA or Youth for Christ or Young Life or something like that. There's a lot of organizations out there. Those are probably some of the most popular. So Youth Alive for us isn't just our version, because I think that's what denominations can do, is their version of the same thing. For us, Youth Alive is thinking missionally about a junior high and a high school campus, so raising up students as missionaries. So what that means is we can collaborate with an FCA or a Young Life or Youth for Christ. We're not into branding, we're into seeing a movement happen. And so we're raising up students as missionaries on their campus. We just did an event a couple weeks ago with a few hundred teenagers from all across Southern California who want to reach their campus, right? It's sort of, I don't know if any of you guys ever had the privilege of going to like a summer camp or a youth convention or something like that. Those events are highly evangelistic. This is very discipleship focused for student leaders and things like that. And another element of that that kind of connects with Youth Alive, we've launched the Called Initiative, which is John Zick, he's one of our national leaders, wrote a book entitled Called, all about developing your calling and getting into ministry. And for us in the youth department, we were like, how can we start this pipeline early? How can we see students? If we believe in students, we always are like, we believe in young people. God can use you no matter how young you are. Youth Alive and Called are sort of us putting our money where our mouth is, and to echo what Pastor Dave was saying, trying things in a new way. So Called is a conference we did here at Vanguard. We're gonna do it again in January, where we gather teenagers from all across Southern California, from Fresno to the border, who feel called to ministry. And we talk to them what that looks like, do some breakouts, just really try to make it practical. And then we do a Called initiative that partners with School of Ministry, which is connected to Vanguard, where essentially these juniors and seniors in high school could graduate with 6 courses already under their belt whether they end up coming here to Vanguard, going to a different ministry school, doing school of ministry, to start the process early of being credentialed and developing their calling. And so just exciting stuff. And I think that's the beauty. The goal and the mission has stayed the same. I'm inspired. I've heard a lot of this stuff before, but it reminds me why I am an ordained Assemblies of God minister. We're the greatest mission sending organization in the world. I don't see any other place that does fellowship the way that we do, and the way that we believe for what God can do. I would rather live a life believing that God can actually do what he says he can do, that miracles can happen, that broken bodies can be made whole, and have like the audacity to believe that sort of thing. And I want to be a part of an organization that believes that as well. And so me personally, that looks like seeing students believe that as well. So yeah, that's what we're doing.
Every church organization, I think in the U.S. right now, has more people retiring than new guys coming in. There's a bailout of pastors. I just posted a thing on Facebook today about that. Part of it had to do with the number of people that are involved in leaving ministry right now. So these guys had the unique task of saying, why don't we start earlier on the beginning end, since we're saying goodbye to so many on the other end? Why don't we start early over here? And I remember the phrases that you used when you talked to me, you described this to me the first time. Raise the possibility to a high school kid that God's calling them into the ministry, and begin to get them to prepare. And if somebody would come along to me in high school like that and said, after I began to get serious with God as a junior in high school, would you like to at least inquire into what it might be like? And that's what they're doing with this thing. So they put out the call, are you interested at all in going into the ministry? Come together and let's talk about what you might begin to do in your life, where you would end up a full-time minister. And that first meeting that I went to there, that you had, you planned on how many showed up?
Yeah, that's the cool part about this stuff. Youth Alive and Called have only existed in student ministries here in Southern California for about 2 years, and we were expecting, we planned for 100 here at Vanguard, and we had 400 show up, which was a nightmare when it came to your cafeteria. They were not ready for us. That whole event, it was insane, but those are good problems to have, because it just proves the point that God is not done with Southern California. You look at stuff happening on the news or social media, there's a movement taking place here that reminds me of our roots, and that God's not done with young people. There's a hunger and a desire, and it's so incredible to watch that take place.
Okay, let me drop back and talk about world missions and home missions a little bit, and some things about structure. We started sending missionaries right away, and we ended up, that next book that Mel puts out, when it finally hits print, about how they came from Azusa Street and went out around the world, that's going to have some embarrassing stories in it, because we were way too simple, not organized enough. They said, well, let's see, she speaks in tongues and sounds Chinese. It must be a call to China. And on the strength of that, somebody would commit their lives and go to China, pack a steamer trunk and plan on spending years in China or India or someplace. We sent people off with inadequate, no cultural preparation. Some of them succeeded wildly, and others died within a couple months after getting there. Boy, there are some hard lessons that were learned along the way. But one of the best things that we did, in contrast to the way missions was largely being done at the time, the older denominations would send out ministers, and they would create a compound and recreate their world, recreate the kind of church they had with the kind of music and the kind of doctrine and the kind of everything else. And then they would pull people out of the culture and into a westernized, either a European missionary would recreate theirs, or an American would recreate New England, because a lot of missionaries came out from New England. and they would simply take them out of their culture and language and teach them a whole new kind of reality. There were some good things that happened. For instance, David Jenkins' book is interesting in that it goes to country after country in Africa where those compounds were, and there will be a difference in literacy, a difference in standard of living, a difference in whatever that came out of those compounds because they raised an awareness of literacy, they raised an awareness of education, they raised the possibility of being a citizen of the world as opposed to just being part of their country. There's demonstrable better life in those kind of places where those old compounds were. But there was not effective missionary work that was done out of there because you were pulling people out of their culture. And one of the things that happened with the Assemblies is we ended up being an organization that says, anything that I have from God, you can have too, and I'm going to teach it to you as quickly as you can. And as soon as you know two things, I'm going to send you out to teach one thing, at least one of them, to somebody else. We had very low educational expectations, for instance. We got kicked out at the start from organizations that had high levels of Bible college or at least college of some kind and seminary. And once a person opened their lives to the fullness of the Spirit and began to be used by God in the ways that are there part of the book of Acts, you would be asked to leave your organization. So we formed this organization that didn't have a lot of educational things, but we said, are you called of the Spirit? Is there something in your heart that's going on? And we want to see that, and if we see that, we won't have so much education. We'll trust that you'll learn the doctrine and learn this, further yourself with your education in the Bible and in theology later down the line. I went to seminary with guys that when they got out, they didn't necessarily have done, perhaps they hadn't done any work at all in a church. But when they got out of seminary, they wrote out a sermon, and on the strength of they would pass a doctrinal test, write a sermon, and have their seminary degree, and they were put out to ministry. And when I got out of seminary, I was allowed just opening license, and I still had to go out and work for 2 years and let people see, was there anything going on in my heart? Was there fruit coming out of the ministry? Was there integrity? Had I integrated my faith with what was going on inside? So we have had that right from the start. One of those courses that I took in seminary was of world missions, what God is doing all around the world, and we all had to do a project. I remember the project that I did was to go through a couple books and try to find tracts of to what extent are the Assemblies of God preparing ministers of that culture to minister to that culture. And after a while, I got a top level grade in the paper, but it solved itself after a while because here was a great deal to work with. I went to country after country after country, and they'll talk about the size of the church, and we would have only been there for 10 years as opposed to somebody else who had been there for 75 years. So our churches would be small, but they would say, well, the Assemblies of God has more people training for the ministry right now than anybody else. And that was true in country after country after country. And I got to see the fruit of that. In the year 2000, we had because it was the year 2000, we had a big international gathering of all the leaders of the Assemblies of God in Indianapolis, Indiana. And everybody came marching in. They all had their country's flag and whatnot. And it was inspirational no end. And the speaker was Lazarus Chakwara, who at that point was the general superintendent of the Assemblies of God from Tanzania in Africa. And he got up, I don't know whether it was his opening words anymore, but I remember clearly what he said. He said, "We were your project, now we are your partner." And that has been the key, where our whole sense of whatever we got from God, you can have too. And it'll be slower, but we want to see, we don't want to run stuff. We want you, as soon as you possibly can, to run it yourself and have the thing stand so that this church stands on its own 2 feet self-supported, self-propagated, self-governed, and handling its own affairs. And so we have partners all around the world. That has been one of the keys of the Pentecostal movement. There have been some countries where we did not do that, and it has blown up in our faces there. The work has been either very small or downright explosive, that it simply did not, after a while it came apart. That was one of the ways that stand out about our history with missions. The other part of it is that here in the U.S. we've stayed open to some new possibilities. I am involved with this national park ministry that I told you about a bit ago, and I ran into some guys that are now organized as official Assemblies of God missionaries in the trails of the national parks. And we have a guy who's full-time on the Appalachian Trail. We have a guy who's full-time out here in the trails of the West. He does Taco Tuesdays, gives out tacos and ministers to people. We try to stay open to the new ways that God might be working through people to do stuff. I brought along a couple books. We have where's the yearbook that I have to return? Oh, that is at your library. You have a wonderful section of books about the history of the Assemblies of God over there. You have a ton of books if you ever get involved in reading anything. Dr. Morgan said I'm supposed to bring this along and at least wave it at you. I did a 2-volume book called Luke and Life, which is a study. There are two things that I really love. One of them is looking up the Greek roots of words. And Luke uses more words, and he uses them differently from the other 4 gospel writers. So I do a bunch of that, and how his message is unique in regard to women in the church, unique in regard to Christ's emotion, unique in regard to the global aspects of the ministry. He has some unusual parts. I started writing this book about 10 years ago once my when speaking ministry began to decline. So it ended up being so much material that I end up having 2 books now on Amazon.com that is now available, and I do the other thing, and that is to talk about the ways that it has impacted my life by telling stories of what took place. Let me give you one more story about the church as a whole. A couple years ago, because I'd gotten involved with ministry to the poor and ministry on an interdenominational basis, and so my name got somehow somebody's attention. I was asked to serve on a panel at Fullerton College up the road here. They were going to have a total organizational, all kinds of church organizations in to talk about your holy writings and what you do with them. So I thought, okay, and I got there, and there was supposed to be Catholic, Jew, Muslim guy, Hindu guy, whatever. There was all that. There was supposed to be a mainline denomination guy. There was supposed to be an evangelical. I was the Pentecostal that was asked to come. And I got there and found out that none of the other Christians showed up. And it was me. I was the lone Christian. And so there was the Hindu guy, and there was the Muslim guy, and there was even a Wicca dude who was there. So there were 8 or 9 of us all across the front, and they said, okay, here's the first question. First question is, what does your holy writing say about how you are to treat other people? I thought, well, all right, I got this one. That one's not too hard. So I'm about the 3rd or 4th one down the line, and I say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule, words of Jesus. So by this time I'm listening, and everybody else has practically the same rule. We all have wonderful statements about what we are supposed to do with it. So I'm thinking, well, I guess maybe, I don't know how this thing is going to turn out, but we're all here on level ground so far. So then they said, okay, here's the second question. What does your organization do with that by way of helping other people? And they went in, and here's where there was no red sword or red crescent like there is the Red Cross among the Muslim community. There's none of the organizations, the Buddhists were not organized to do all that much by way of help for others. And it began to dawn on me, man, I've got a great story to tell. So it got to me and I said, well, probably the worst of it was the wicked dude said, once a year we take a sandwich across it, maybe once a year. We try at least once a year to take a sandwich across the street to the homeless guy. And that's what the Union of Wicca Churches had to report by way of helping out others along the way. I said, well, let me tell you about a Southern California pastor named John Bueno that went down to South America as a missionary, and he was across the street from a dump that had no schools. So he came back and raised money to build a school building and to hire teachers, and he teaches people, the children of the trash area that have no access to any other school. And he's come back and going back and forth and raised more money and built more buildings, and now there's about 75,000 that are getting school for nothing scattered all across Latin America. That, there was this, and I told about Teen Challenge, about how we go there, we don't charge anything. You don't have to pay for Teen Challenge. You got a kid that's an addict, you come there, he is in the program for a year, there's a high probability that he will not go back to it at all. And then I turned I smiled happily at the Hindu guy who had just kind of managed to say something a little bit annoying in my direction. So I said, and you'll be glad to hear this, the women of Southern California, not of the Christian churches as a whole, but just the Assemblies of God churches, last year the women raised about $400,000 to go to India and buy little girls they'd been sold into prostitution, buy them out, put them in homes, and teach them another whole trade so that they can handle life on their own. So that's how we treat other people in regard, as opposed the way we would like to be treated. And suddenly, by the time we're done, none of the other organizations had anything to say, anything to compare of. And it dawned on me what the people of the book who take mission seriously, who take helping the poor seriously, we back off and are apologetic about way too much in the crusades of years gone by and whatever. We have incredible tales to tell about reaching out and helping people. And there is a strong testimony that we have to stand on. We've got a story like no other. So I remain enthused about what our part of that Christian group, the Assemblies of God, has done. So thank you for your time. God bless you.